And hello, everybody, wherever you are and whatever time it is. My name is Adrian Untermyer. I am the host of Wrecking Ball, the podcast series from the Historical Society of the New York Courts, where we tackle the often interrelated themes of historic preservation, the law, and the great city and state of New York. And today's topic of conversation is one of those that checks all of those boxes and then some. You could say it checks them with a big Sharpie, because we are talking about the High Line today. It is one of those places that at this point feels like it's been around forever. But most of us remember when the High Line actually opened as a public park. And before that, it was something very different entirely. And we are going to get into all of that today with our incredible guest, Jonathan Broder, who's joining us here. John is the former General Counsel of the Consolidated Rail Corporation, which we are going to be talking a lot about during today's podcast. It's a big name. It's often referred to as Conrail, and it in and of itself has a very interesting history. So a big welcome to you, John, and thanks for agreeing to be our guest here today.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to everyone that this is a production of the Historical Society of New York Courts. And if you want to learn more, just check out the Historical Society of the New York Courts online. And if you like what you're hearing, make sure to like, follow, subscribe, wherever you're doing that, wherever you listen to us today. So yes, we're talking about the High Line today. But to talk about the High Line, it is a repurposed old railroad track, right? It is an example, and I'd say a shining example of adaptive reuse and historic preservation, which is that principle where you take an old thing, and rather than just chucking it, you make it new because the next generation you believe will benefit from the lessons, the stories, the aesthetics, the stage set, as Tony Wood put it in the first episode of our series, for so many wonderful things that happen in urban life and in suburban or rural life, right? Adaptive reuse is now a part of our culture, and we're glad to have it. And we're going to start, speaking of old things, with one of the oldest things we have here in American life, and it's where our story begins, which is the American Railroad. It is often said that railroads contributed to building this country. And we're not going to go all the way back to Mr. Stevens with his circular railroad track in Hoboken, where we really had the proving ground of the early railroads. But John, I think I'd like us to start our story in 1887, which is long before the High Line was built, and it is long before the park was created. But that is when we had a very interesting statute pass at the federal level. John, this was the birth of the so-called Interstate Commerce Commission, which was in fact one of the earliest regulatory agencies, if not the earliest independent agency in United States history. And this was the railroads regulator. So John, in that sort of crucible of the late 1800s, what was going on in American life as we were moving from an agrarian society to an urban society, becoming ever more reliant on the railroads?
So if you start back even a little bit earlier than 1887, so really the first American railroad started 1829, 1830 is when the first tracks were being laid. The first steam locomotive was imported from England to be used. And you basically had the beginnings of the railroad network being constructed during the 1830s, probably the first what we would call depression, but what they used to call panics back then. The panic of 1837 was caused by over speculation in railroads at that time. And you continue to have a fair amount of construction into the 1850s. That sort of takes you to the period, we can come back to that, when the railroad infrastructure that ultimately became the High Line was actually first laid down on the west side of New York City. And then you have the Civil War, and really coming out of the Civil War, you had really the last and probably the greatest boom of railroad construction. A lot of the engineers who worked in the Civil War and generals in the Civil War sort of pivoted and went right into the railroad industry. That was the place to go. It was really the equivalent of what we have in the tech industry today. It was the first network industry that really sort of bound together the country and networked towns, cities, states, ports, everything you could imagine at that stage, and everybody wanted to get into it. You had another series of major strikes that were occurring in the 1870s as the railroads were being built. I mean, at that point, most railroad workers were getting paid about $1 a day if they were lucky, and the injury rates were extremely high. Just to give you a quick factoid, around 1870, the estimate is that the industry was responsible for about 70,000 deaths in 1 year. It's everything, of course, from workers blowing themselves up, trying to build tunnels and bridges, locomotives hitting each other, railroad bridges catching on fire, pedestrians being hit, anything you can imagine. So you had that sort of going on in this period leading up to 1887. Then you had what I mentioned before, all of the speculation in railroads. The early New York Stock Exchange, almost all of the first issuers were railroads and a handful of financial institutions too. It wasn't really until after J.P. Morgan in the early 1900s that you had really large industries that were really using the stock market at that point. You had the federal government was handing out enormous amounts of land grants to build particularly the railroad in the West as well. So everybody was really into this thing, and everybody sort of really needed the railroad at that point. Now, what happened was, really from the 1850s to the 1870s, you had your first series of what I'll call railroad consolidation. So the four great trunk lines is what they were called, were formed at that point. You had the Pennsylvania Railroad, you had the New York Central Railroad, you had the New York and Erie, which was just called the Erie Railroad. They, basically went from Chicago to New York, were built out that way. And then you had the Baltimore and Ohio, which was the fourth of the great trunk railroads too. And they were gobbling up lots of other little railroads, competing against each other. And what was happening is because there were so many railroads back then, the amount of rate competition that was going on, the price that was being charged, whether it be for passengers or to move freight, people were cutting rates, raising rates. People were going bankrupt left and right. The number of railroad bankruptcies in the 1870s was unbelievable at that stage of the game. You had a tremendous amount of fraud going on in the industry where a lot of the railroads were sort of keeping separate sets of books. Again, this is all pre-regulation where, basically anything went. Tons of insider trading, watered stock, you name it, they were doing it back then. It got to a point where, you get into the 1870s and 1880s, and there's a public outcry against these behemoths. At one point, I believe the number was 1 out of every 5 people in the United States worked for the railroad, to give you the idea of how overwhelming an impact the industry had on the country at that point. And that ultimately led to, essentially a large compromise, and what was called technically the Act to Regulate Commerce was passed and signed by President Cleveland in 1887, creating the Interstate Commerce Commission. And you're right, it was the first federal agency to regulate an industry at that point. And really all of the agencies after that patterned themselves on the old ICC, very similar language, whether it was the FCC or the SEC or any of the other alphabet agencies created over the next 50 years. But, really that period from 1887 to, I would say, about the First World War was really the apex of the industry, where you had this kind of overwhelming domination. And of course, they were building these citadels, these incredible stations, talking about your architecture issues during that point, to sort of symbolize how important this industry was to everybody in the country.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned the Erie Railroad, right? We have a very legal-minded audience on this legal podcast, and a lot of you may remember Erie Doctrine or some of those other railroad cases. And your point about these being the tech sector of their time is absolutely correct. It's a great analogy. And we're going to be talking about a series of railroads that really were the Googles of the world. But yeah, that 1887 date, it's really one of the many inflection points that we're going to be looking at throughout the history of the High Line. And that was the point where railroad regulation really starts to, in the parlance of today, become a thing.
Right.
And the Interstate Commerce Commission really did set the tone for a lot of economic regulation. Aviation, in many ways, was a highly regulated industry at its outset. And this question of regulation has been debated quite a bit. I do want to share a fun little quote about the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, from none other than the infamous highway builder Robert Moses, who we've discussed a bit on this podcast. And he once said that the ICC is in a condition which would be laughable if it's not so serious. Because as I've written and others have written, its dustiness, its deliberativeness, shall we say, that ended up being a bit of a challenge for the railroads, right? Because they were these very powerful entities. All of a sudden, they were subject to the plenary regulatory power of this rather unwieldy organization that was not quite an agency, not quite a court, had numerous members. They would come on and off the panel over time. They did want to always get it right. With an understanding that they were making precedent and making law in many cases, and so things took forever. And oftentimes railroads found themselves, not in bankruptcy court at the time, but in bankruptcy because this body was taking a lot of time and it was taking time to stem the bleeding. So we're going to keep that ICC and that regulatory dynamic in our heads for later on in the story because it is really important prequel to what we're going to be talking about. But for now, let's move a little bit forward in time to when the railroads were a bit fat and happy. There were some waves of bankruptcies, as we discussed, but a lot of things were happening in urban areas, including New York City, during that turn of the century, turn of the 1800s to the 1900s moment. And we start to see expansions and grade separations, which is a concept where you are separating the railroad from the people and the horses and the vehicles, the wagons, all that down on the street. So as we're starting to see this push towards efficiency, towards grade separation, this concept for a high line begins to bubble up. And John, I think there are some stories about death, destruction, fear, all of that led to the original construction of this high line. So tell us a little bit about how we got the original concoction.
Sure. So, I'll provide, maybe some more technical terms here. So, we call it the High Line. So the actual railroad name of this line is the West 30th Street Secondary Track, which then connected to the West Side Line, which runs, all the way up the east side of the Hudson up to Albany. It was originally owned by the New York and Hudson Railroad. There were actually several railroads in New York City that got consolidated by the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, really through the 1860s and the early 1870s into what's known as the New York Central, which this became part of. This ran basically from down where the Holland Tunnel is today, was sort of the terminus at a place called St. John's Park, which was an area where you could float cars across the harbor, rail cars on barges. And that's how they got back and forth between New Jersey and New York at that point, because the direct rail route from over the Hudson, you actually ended up having to go either at one point to Albany or to Poughkeepsie to get across, where there was a freight bridge to get around that way. So that was down at the southern end. And then it ran all along at street level, like I said, up to a place called Spuyten Duyvil, which you may be familiar with, which is, I think it's the spit of the devil, but it's, it's an old Dutch term from the Dutch years that the city, when the city was, a Dutch colony, just at the northern tip of Manhattan that would take you into the Bronx and all the way up. So, for many, many years, like you were saying, Adrian, this created a tremendous amount of safety issues because you were running these trains. And it was something like, at one point, 30 to 40 trains a day were running along this line. And this was a heavy manufactured area, this lower west side of Manhattan. A lot of warehousing and piers and all kinds of stuff going on at that stage. They nicknamed what was at that point essentially 10th or 11th Avenue Death Avenue because of the number of people who were getting killed by the trains or hit by the trains. So ultimately, the New York Central brought these railroad cowboys, is what they're called, on horseback, who would ride with a cowboy hat on in front of the trains, waving a red flag, blowing a whistle to warn people that the train was coming. And so, for several decades, the public authorities and the railroad were talking about, how do we, fix this thing? And ultimately, and you mentioned Robert Moses, he was involved with this project at that point. You had this mega public-private partnership is what we would call it today. They weren't calling it that back then, with essentially the predecessor of what's the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the state of New York, as well as the New York Central, agreed to what was then an astronomical sum of $120 million to grade separate the West 30th Street secondary track. So essentially, the track was elevated from down at the St. John's Park. They created this head house, which is still there. Actually, I believe Google is now, speaking of tech companies, is now renting that space. And you can see the four bays still where the trains used to go into that building about 10 blocks south of where the High Line terminates today. That was sort of the end of the High Line where it began, and ran up to what we call 30th Street Yard, which is today Camera Yards, which the Long Island Railroad now uses to service and marshal trains going into Penn Station, wrapped itself around the yard, and then went below grade, under the street level, under where today the Javits Center is, and then wound its way up under the streets. And Riverside Park was built to cap the railroad line. If you walk under the beginning of Riverside Park up around 72nd Street, you will see that that is not a real park. This is something sitting on steel stilts, the railroad lines down at the bottom of the grade, and they built this park up on top. It's really an astounding thing to go look at. And it continues up to 125th Street. So if you're driving up the West Side Highway, you can see where the train comes out up there right around Grant's Tomb, and then proceeds up to Spuyten and Duyvil, as I mentioned, back up to Albany at that stage. So it was just this massive project. And essentially what happened is all of the industries that were located on the Lower West Side, they essentially demolished most of these industries that required rail service, reconstructed them so that everything was up on the second floor, is where all the loading docks were. And the trains literally would go through the building and unload or load freight at that stage. And that was all between 1929 and 1931.
Wow. And, if we keep mentioning Robert Moses' name, this is going to be less of a podcast and more of a drinking game. But I will mention his name one more time because speaking of Riverside Park, there's that famous scene in The Power Broker where Moses and Francis Perkins are out in the boat in the Hudson, and he's pointing out what he wants to do, pointing out those railroad tracks and saying, couldn't this be a better asset to the city? And was what was pretty much a precursor, I would say, to the High Line project, because other railroads were capped and turned into parks quite a number of decades earlier, just with Riverside Park a little bit further north from the current High Line we know today. But Robert Moses is also relevant because as this High Line is constructed and the railroads start to be a little less fat and happy, the influences, the tendrils of Mr. Moses and his men do become highly relevant, because the railroads, while they got a bit of a stay of execution, I would say, during the Second World War, where the sheer amount of wartime traffic, both troops and regular people and freight for the war effort, were keeping the railroads flush, all of our technological advances during World War II ended up coming back to bite those railroads, right? Because we came out of World War II wanting to live in suburbs, looking to build this massive interstate highway network, and also with a newfound familiarity and fluency with aviation, which had really been perfected during the Second World War. All those factors, combined with that other factor we were talking about earlier, that regulatory factor, to really amp up the pressure on the railroads. They start to really hurt. And I would say it started to intensify in the 1950s. And the 1960s is where you really started to see weird things happening. The New York Central Railroad, which we mentioned earlier, it starts looking around for someone to take to the dance. It thinks a merger is its only way out. They have their eyes on one carrier, it doesn't work out, and they decide to merge with their arch rival, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the standard railroad of the world. And I think their rivalry was epitomized by the two different stations that we have in New York City to this day. We have Grand Central Terminal, which was the New York Central's passenger terminal, and we have Pennsylvania Station, which was Pennsylvania Railroad's flagship there in New York. Suddenly these were one company, and since both of the partners at the dance weren't doing too well beforehand, and because of all the regulatory requirements, I would say, that were added as conditions of this merger from the Interstate Commerce Commission, That new Penn Central Corporation ends up going bankrupt in what at the time was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. It was the biggest one up until Enron of the last couple decades. This is a massive economic collapse, and the government starts to step in at this point. And John, I was hoping you might be able to pick it up here, because a lot of things are happening at this second inflection point that we're talking about, that crucible of the late 60s, early 70s. What happened to railroads then?
You provided a pretty good summary. I'll just to sort of put a bow on it. I mean, really, the railroads really started getting in trouble, really as early as the period right before World War One, believe it or not, because the government actually nationalized all the railroads during the First World War because they weren't confident that they'd be able to do what was needed to support the war effort. And there was a real question in 1920 whether they were going to put it back out into the private business. They talked about permanently nationalizing the railroads, but then they decided in the end, in the Transportation Act of 1920, to go ahead and give it another try. But a big piece of that was for the industry to start thinking about rationalizing their assets and looking strategically at combining systems at that point. But a lot of that just did not happen, because then you had the Depression hit, and like you said, World War II hit. And once World War II is over and you get to about 1948, 1950, everything sort of goes back to the mean. So, at one time, of course, passenger traffic was a major baseline for railroads. This almost evaporates by the time, for the reasons you mentioned, that you get into the 1960s. People are driving, people are taking planes, they're not taking long distance trains anymore. Yet the Interstate Commerce Commission, because of the regulatory system, which has not changed at that point in 50 years, and was basically designed for what they believe were these giant monopolists that were making, ridiculous sums of money, are now regulating essentially what's an industrial basket case. So you can't abandon routes. You're forced to continue to run these trains, whether you're making money on them or not. You're not making enough money to invest in the trains or in the tracks. So everything's beginning to fall apart. You've got, like you mentioned, the PRR NYC merger first starts getting really discussed in the late 50s. They end up filing for it in 1961-62. It takes 6 years to get through that process. And during that period of time, however bad things were in 1958-59, of course, are only getting worse. There's less and less business there, basically, for all of this infrastructure that's out there. And, along with the Penn Central, we're talking about the northeast part of the country at this point. There are 5 or 6 other railroads in that area who are competitors to the Penn Central: the Reading Railroad, the Central and New Jersey Railroad, the Erie-Lackawanna back to the Erie Railroad, the Lehigh Valley Railroad. They're all competing for a smaller and smaller piece of the pie, and they're all still having to move passenger rail. Most people don't recognize today that not only intercity rail, but all the commuter rail was all run by private companies prior to 1970. And you just simply could not get rid of that business if you wanted. And then the other side of it, of course, and this gets to your point about driving, with the construction of the interstate highway system, under the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, this really allows the trucking industry to take off. And the trucking industry takes huge bites out of the share of business that the railroads had previously enjoyed. So you have this constant shrinking pressure, a business that can't really be nimble. You could not raise your rate, cut your rate, abandon a line, enter into an agreement with another railroad without the permission of the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was illegal to enter into a contract with a customer. Everything had to be filed in a public tariff. Again, a regulatory system for a completely, like, the Gilded Age type of a thing. So you had all of this sort of come down together at one point. So, the Penn Central lasted as a railroad prior to bankruptcy, I think it's 18 months.
Yeah.
And initially, they try to reorganize it under the standard Section 77 railroad bankruptcy law before Judge Fulham here in Philadelphia. And they pretty much realized within a year or year and a half that it is unreorganizable, that there's no way to reorganize it, given the debt, given the creditors, given the assets, given the condition of the railroad, through a normal bankruptcy proceeding. So at which point Judge Fulham basically says to the Penn Central, he said, "You better come up with a plan. We're going to start liquidation."
Mhm.
And once that happened, all the fire alarms went off in Washington. So this is really 1972, 73. There was actually a national strike, which finally, I think, woke up folks at that point. You know, just briefly, the two key conditions that really saddled the Penn Central were mandatory labor protection, basically meaning you had to guarantee jobs for all of the people who were working on these railroads, whether there was work or not for them, which becomes rather expensive as you continue to lose business. And they were forced to include the old New Haven Railroad because the New Haven couldn't independently operate. And of course, they were running out of Grand Central up into New England and everything. And that again was a huge weight on the Penn Central at that stage. So what happens is the Nixon administration basically, along with Congress at this point, start running around trying to figure out how to deal with this. Now, initially, the first thing that happens is they pass the National Passenger Rail Act in 1970. So in 71, Amtrak is formed and takes over the intercity passenger system. So the freight railroads are relieved at that, but they're still operating all the commuter operations at that stage of the game. And they discussed a bunch of plans. They try to get some of the other railroads in the region, like the B&O, like the Norfolk and Western, to take over some of these assets, but they all said, no, thank you. I don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. But, a lot of the railroads in the country, in particular, interestingly, the Union Pacific, is very concerned because, they're only going to Chicago. How is all their business going to get over here? They don't want to see the railroad system fail. So behind the scenes, they, along with a number of other legislators, policymakers, come up with this idea of a Consolidated Rail Corporation, hence the name Conrail. They passed the 3R Act in 1973, which comes up with a planning process, creates something called the United States Railroad Association, and they're required within 6 months to come up with something called the Final System Plan. And this group of government experts is supposed to decide what assets are used or useful that we would put into a new railroad at this point that we think could possibly be viable. They come up with a plan for that. And then essentially in 1974, under the 4R Act, Congress then approved that plan. Conrail comes into operation April 1st, 1976. It actually was set up prior to that in 75. It's owned 85% by the federal government. The stock is owned 85%, 15% by the employees. And then Conrail not only takes over those assets from the Penn Central that are conveyed to it, but also those other railroads mentioned. It's made up of 6 bankrupt railroads at this stage of the game. So you have that going on. And then at the same time, and this is part of a inflection and mega trend going on in the country at that stage, there's a complete rethinking about federal regulation and how to regulate these industries at this stage of the game. And a real push, this is, really kind of a reaction to the old New Deal style of regulation, that we should really let the free market operate more where there is a competitive market, and we should start deregulating. And the railroads are one of the first, industries where the whole mania for deregulation starts. You have really the guy who came up with the economic theory. It was New York's, a Con, who had come out of Con Edison and had come up with a lot of the theories of deregulation in the gas industry locally in New York. At that point, he's hired by Jimmy Carter to come in and work on airline deregulation.
Mhm.
And basically, you've got the airlines, the trucking industry, the railroad industry, all in the late 70s up to 1980, where laws are passed to deregulate these industries. What I'd like to say is basically reform the regulation. They're not like unregulated. There's still plenty of regulation around, but it's intended to be much more sensitive to market conditions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're no longer dealing with this situation where every single thing you do is going to this slow as molasses regulator. You're seeing more of a streamlined process. And as all of these tectonic shifts in the rail industry are taking place, our lowly little High Line, pardon the pun, is sort of sitting there with its traffic diminishing. What is happening on the High Line during these interesting years in
Right.
railroading?
So, along with the mega trends, you have the deindustrialization of these urban areas in the Midwest and the East in particular occurring. So really, Now, I have a debate with the folks at the Friends of the High Line about when the last business actually ran. Based on the research we did internally at Conrail, Conrail believes it never actually operated the High Line, even though it was conveyed to it through this final system plan process I mentioned, and that the last bit of rail traffic was frozen turkeys in a boxcar over
Oh,
Thanksgiving in 1968, delivered to what's the New York meat market, which is still there right now. That was the last business. The High Line people seem to think that there was service up there in 1980. I do know that there was some minimal business at 30th Street Yard. There was a team track there. There's a couple of customers where we would drop a car off. They'd drive a truck into 30th Street Yard, pick up their load, and move on. There was a very large yard, the 59th Street Yard, which ran from 59th to 72nd Street, which is today Trump City. The Penn Central actually retained. So Penn Central was reorganized after the bankruptcy, but basically as a real estate company, no longer as a railroad company. And actually, it still exists today under a different name. It's called American Premier Underwriters, is what Penn Central is today, is a successor company. And basically, all of the areas where there was no real perspective for really substantial rail being developed there, they retained ownership of the property, and Conrail was essentially granted the operating rights to run it so long as there was any business. So they were negotiating with Fred Trump for years, and they eventually sold it, and Donald Trump took it over. And of course, that yard, the last bit of business there was newsprint that Conrail brought in there that was going to Times Square and was going to the New York Times when they were still printing the newspapers over there, and the Daily News as well. They ultimately moved their paper supplier up to the Bronx. And at that stage of the game, in the early 80s, we got out of that. Conrail sold the piece of the railroad from, essentially 34th Street north to Amtrak. Amtrak took it over because Amtrak was still running its Empire service out of Grand Central Station, but wanted consolidated everything into Penn Station. So that was how they were going to get up to Albany, and they built a direct tunnel out of Penn Station over to the West Side Line. And then from 34th Street south, you essentially had a piece of infrastructure that was sitting there. The only thing that really happened was Conrail agreed in the early 80s when they were building the Javits Center to relocate the line. And it used to be go as far north as 35th Street before it went down into the grade. We agreed to move it back to 34th Street so they could put the footprint of the convention center in there. And really from that early to mid 80s period, there was really no other activity going on other than the fact that many of the property owners in that neighborhood wanted the High Line torn down very much for development purposes.
absolutely. And all in the background of this, and we encourage you to go back and listen to episode 1 of the Wrecking Ball series if you'd like more on this, but you have the burgeoning historic preservation movement really coming to a head in New York City in the mid-1960s, as well, as people are saying, my gosh, the places that we love are disappearing before our very eyes. It's often said, and it's a little bit more complicated than that the Pennsylvania railroads phased demolition in the mid-1960s of their original Pennsylvania station was the straw that broke the camel's back. Again, please go to our episode for more of the nuances, shall we say, on that. But the bottom line is you have these giant shifts in the railroad industry. You have these giant shifts in the industrial nature of New York. You have these giant shifts in how people are looking at the city and thinking about their old infrastructure and their old assets. And this High Line is increasingly becoming old, and to John's point, becoming a bit of an eyesore to some. Keep in mind as well, the West Side Highway at this time is beginning to deteriorate. There's a famous anecdote, not sure of the exact year, but when a truck actually falls through the West Side Highway, and those two structures visually looked very similar. And in New York's imagination, people started to wonder about these crumbling old assets in their view. But some New Yorkers thought differently, right, John? Let's pick up where this sort of seedling of an idea for repurposing this old rail line really takes place, from a place where you got a boxcar full of frozen turkeys and no cranberry sauce, and that's it, to one of the world's most premier public parks. So where did the roots and shoots of the High Line start to emerge against all that context?
This is where I personally come onto the story. So I joined Conrail in 1988. And I grew up in the New York area. I'm from Teaneck, New Jersey, and my father and mother were New Yorkers, and I knew the city very well. And my boss came to my office one day and said, Jonathan, we've got this rail line in Midtown Manhattan that is immersed in a lot of litigation. I'd like you to start working on this thing. And I said, there's no freight line in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. What are you talking about? Said, oh,
Little
yes,
did you know.
yes, there is. So the first time I laid my eyes on the High Line was in probably February, March of 1989. I went with a group of lawyers and other folks from Conrail for a little bit of tour. You know, you essentially had this, really beautiful sort of untamed, piece of infrastructure with natural flowers and plants growing on it. You were 21 feet up in the air. There was nothing there. It was perfectly silent. You don't, today, of course, you've got buildings engulfing the High Line. At that time, you didn't have that. You had beautiful vistas across the river into Midtown Manhattan. And it was really, in its sort of wildness, a very beautiful thing at that point. Well, like you were saying, some people didn't think it was so beautiful. So we had a group of landowners that was led by Edison Parking and their principal, Jerome Gottesman, who passed away a few years ago. And Conrail was, quite frankly, trying to shed this albatross because it was really nothing but trouble. There were some technical legal reasons because the way the New York Central obtained rights to build the High Line, they did not actually own any of the underlying property. They received a box easement, as we call it, in the air. And many of the easement documents basically said that when this is no longer being used as a railroad, you, the railroad, have to pay to take this thing down.
Wow.
And all of the real estate interest will revert back to the underlying property owners. There's something like, I think, 60 or 70 individual deeds that had to be assembled in order to construct the High Line at that point, back in the 20s and 30s. So, we did not want to have to pay for this. It was going to cost, back then, we estimated something like $40 million to tear the line down. So we tried to negotiate. At one point, if you remember, there was a project, you mentioned the West Side Highway, Westway,
Oh,
back
yes.
in the 80s, where they wanted to extend the West Side Highway further south. And one idea was to use some of the High Line for some of that. So we actually had a deal to sell the High Line to New York State for $1. And then, when a lot of the environmental interests started protesting Westway and the whole thing fell apart, New York State sort of backed out of that deal. Then at one point, we had agreed to basically sell the line to the underlying property owners. They formed an organization called the Chelsea Property Owners, CPO, that Mr. Gottesman was funding, but they refused to indemnify Conrail for any liability that arose out of the demolition or anything else that might happen. So we couldn't work out a deal with them. They then filed a lawsuit at the old Interstate Commerce Commission that we called involuntary abandonment, where you basically would get the commission to issue an order that would force Conrail to abandon the line, which would then trigger these easement provisions I was mentioning, that would then trigger Conrail's obligation to tear the line down and pay all of this money. So this all starts in the late 80s into the early 90s. The case winds its way through the commission and the courts, and ultimately what the ICC rules is that, okay, we try to come up actually with some opportunities to reactivate service on the line. We actually had Browning Ferris, the former waste disposal company, had agreed to ship waste over the High Line from Lower Manhattan.
Neighbors would have loved that.
They supported it, actually. Community Board 2 and Community Board 4, which is whose areas the line went through, signed letters of support, because at that time,
Oh, wow.
their belief was the unique sort of ecosystem in that neighborhood of Chelsea and the Upper Village, that the High Line was the only thing protecting it from gentrification. They did not want gentrification, and they were willing to put up with movements of solid waste. That didn't work out. And ultimately what the commission said was, okay, we don't see any reasonable possibility of future rail service. We're going to grant the abandonment. However, CPO made a strategic error. They got a contractor by the name of John Picone. You can look him up. He's had his own issues over the years. Put in a bid that said he could take the High Line down for only $7 million. So we said, fine. In fact, after that occurred, I actually had a meeting with the principal and had a check from Conrail made out to the CPO folks for $7 million and said, it's yours. And the rest of it above, you pay. If it going to, of course, they knew it was going to cost a lot more than that. They took an appeal to the Federal Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit, and the D.C. Circuit said, you know what, ICC, this seems like a really Solomonic decision to us. We think you sort of cut the baby in half just the right way. We're going to approve that condition. And this takes you to 1993, 1994, and that sort of ends the legal wrangling at that point for another 5 or 6 years. Now, during that period, I did talk with the folks from the Rails to Trails Coalition down in DC. They didn't want to touch it because the problem was politically, the real estate developers were very tight with the administration. And, from Mayor Koch, Mayor Dinkins, Mayor Giuliani, they all supported demolition of the High Line. And we knew if the city wasn't going to go along with it, it was going to be very hard to do anything about that. And so did the Rails to Trails people at that stage of the game. Move ahead to 1996. In 1996, Conrail becomes subject to probably one of the more well-known hostile takeover battles between Norfolk Southern and CSX, who decide that they want to buy Conrail and split it in half. Long story about how that whole went, but ultimately they were able to reach a deal to split up the company, got submitted to the ICC in 1997, gets approved in 1998, and the actual consummation of the transaction is June 1st of 1999. Under the split agreement, CSX inherits the High Line. However, any residual liability for demolition of the High Line stays with Conrail. And Conrail ended up staying around. The last 10% of Conrail, they couldn't figure out how to split up. It was just basically the New York Metropolitan Freight Market, the South Jersey, Philadelphia Freight Market, and the Detroit Freight Market. So it's a jointly owned private company now. Conrail still operates today. Conrail still had to hold on to this liability at this point. In 99, just before the split, the Edison people file a billion-dollar interference of contract because they want to establish a new Federal Express facility. They have a parking lot between 18th and 19th Street right under the High Line, which they couldn't go through. All those cases we ultimately won. And essentially what happens then is somewhere around, as CSX assumes responsibility for the asset, they can't figure out what to do with it. They're being yelled at by all the politicians, by the real estate developers. And what they do is they sponsor a study to take a look at what are the potential future uses of this. And I forget the name of the planning entity in New York that does these things, but they went and did a bunch of public presentations, and they do a presentation down in Chelsea. And the two folks who end up becoming the principals of the Friends of the High Line happen to go to the meeting because they think the High Line's this beautiful thing that should be saved. And they on the spot formed this Friends of the High Line. Now it happened, it's convenient that one of them was roommates with the guy who used to be the head of city council in New York, who basically says, yeah, we should really look at this at this stage of the game. But this is in the dying days of the Giuliani administration, right after 9/11. CSX basically takes the position, and we go along because they own us, where basically whatever the city wants in the end is what we're going to do. We're not going to fight City Hall, so to speak. And the Giuliani administration still wanted the line torn down. So we actually entered into a voluntary demolition agreement with them. They agreed that we would only be liable up to $7 million. Conrail signs this deal. CSX signs the deal. New York City signs the deal. The MTA signs the deal. It does not sign the deal, and the convention center signs the deal. All the key property owners, and of course the Chelsea property owners signed this deal representing all the property owners. The only party that didn't sign it was the MTA, who owns that yard where the Long Island Railroad is right now. And literally up until midnight of Giuliani's last day in the office, people are making phone calls to try to pressure the state, to pressure the MTA to sign this thing, and they don't. And literally the next morning is a new day. Mayor Bloomberg comes into office. He thinks the High Line, preserving the High Line and converting it into a park seems like a splendid idea to him. He then basically says, we're not pursuing this anymore. We're going to study this some more. And then ultimately the Friends of the High Line put together this incredible campaign to raise funds and come up with designs and do all of this work. And we then pivot from a voluntary demolition agreement to, and I'll show it to you because I brought a copy,
Oh,
one
wonderful.
of my copies.
Look at this. So those of you looking at the YouTube version of our show, you will see rail banked donation of the High Line, bound in black and being held by John. And his arms are probably very tired by now because it looks
That's
like
right.
gigantic
As you
volume.
can see on the bottom there, my name's on it, John Broder, Esquire.
Oh, wonderful.
We got them customized for everybody who was part of the transaction team. And we essentially, there's actually, I'm looking at all, and there's 3, 4, 5, there's 6 of these volumes make up the transaction.
Oh my goodness.
This is only one of 6 volumes to do the whole thing. And it becomes, this really creative transaction, which really allows the High Line to get built. So essentially, the pieces of it are, we agree we're going to donate the line to the city of New York. So there's going to be a donation. The donation is contingent on the city basically doing a new plan of development for this neighborhood and create a new zoning district. It becomes the most significant upzoning project since the days of literally of Rockefeller Center. That's how many years back you have to go that allowed this to happen. Essentially, they create this district that runs from about 14th Street north, and they create these bundles of what are called transfer development rights, which are basically air rights. And they increase the FAR, which is basically the rateable acreage in terms of how much you can build in this area. You can now go up 10 stories instead of only 3 stories because this had been an industrial neighborhood at that point. And if you had property that was right under the High Line where you couldn't build up, you could sell your air rights to people adjoining that. And that's why if you go along there, you're going to see obviously buildings that are a lot taller than 10 or 15 stories because they have accumulated this bundle of transfer development rights in there. So this, of course, makes the real estate developers very excited. So they're happy to sign off on this deal. The other 2 key pieces of the transaction that allow it to happen, Conrail and CSX are still worried about any residual environmental liability because at one point we think this line may have been electrified briefly. So we thought there were PCBs on the line. Also, the fascia on the line was the old New York Central style of bridge construction, which of course was painted with lead paint. So we don't want any responsibility for this. So what they agreed to do actually was purchase an environmental insurance policy that would last 20 years, that in the event anything occurred environmentally, you had insurance to pay for anything, along with the indemnity that we had from the city of New York at that point. The final piece of it was, who's going to run this thing? How is this going to get paid for? So this is really between the city and the Friends of the High Line, and the Friends of the High Line have got to be one of the most successful marketing visionary campaigns I can imagine. They've managed to raise at this point, I think it's close to $200 million to finish this thing to a fine polish, to say the least. I mean, there are other elevated lines like the High Line that have been converted to parks too. Nothing looks like the High Line because of the amount of money they were able to raise. Probably 60 or 70% of it was raised privately by very wealthy hedge fund, private equity people. Diane von Furstenberg and Barry Diller put a ton of money into it. But at that time, Senator Schumer and Clinton, Hillary Clinton was still a senator then, were able to bring in a huge federal earmark. The city came up with a bunch of money too, and they were able to put it together. And you had the first phase open in 2007 at this point. The deal was signed in 2005. It took them, I think, 2 years to do the first project. And then I think phase 2 opened around, I want to say 2011. And then phase 3 was in the teens. And then the 2 last pieces were the spur, which is the old spur that went into the post office. And then I know they just completed this bridge, they call it the bridge, which will take you over to Moynihan Station right now. So now we think it's basically finished at this stage of the game. But it was the nature of that transaction, all of the TDRs that were created under this Euler plan, which was the planning setup, which is why you see what it looks like in that neighborhood right now. It's, last I'd heard, it's now, I think, the most expensive part of the city, even more expensive on a per square foot basis than the Upper East Side, if you can imagine.
It's mind-blowing. And as we used to say back in the day when I was really in the trenches of preservation, our tagline was preservation pays, right? Preservation pays. And we've been calling them occasionally developers here. The great Christopher Goff, as we know, would always encourage us to call them investors because that really showed their true motivations, right? They're here to make money, and hopefully they can improve the city in the process. And it turned out to be a wonderful investment, investing in preservation. So we just covered a lot, right?
Yeah.
We went all the way back, right, to the beginning of railroads in this country and the peculiar economic and regulatory circumstances that brought the New York Central first to build this High Line as a railroad artery, and then to really want to get rid of it during all of the humble and tumble of the 60s and 70s, where you have the New York Central becoming the Penn Central, becoming Conrail, big Conrail, old Conrail, John's old boss, right? Then becoming split into basically a tiny terminal railroad operation, and the bulk of Conrail is owned by these two freight carriers, CSX, Norfolk Southern. CSX happens to be the steward of the High Line. You have a plan to get rid of this thing once and for all that fails. You have a change in municipal administration. You have a deal that holds to preserve this thing. And then you cut the ribbons on the High Line of today. And one of those last portions, for those of you, again, who are looking at home, is pictured behind me now. It's called the Plinth. And it's right before that new wood bridge, that new Moynihan connector that connects over to Hudson Yards and Moynihan Train Hall over on the west side. And on that plinth, it's a frequent location for art displays. The big pink tree behind me, for those of you who are watching, is one of those displays. It's called Old Tree by Pamela Rosenkrantz, and it's there on the High Line plinth through the end of 2024. So definitely go and take a peek. And it really does epitomize what happened to this neighborhood before, during, and after the High Line. And I think a lot of folks will have a nuanced critique regarding the impacts of gentrification and the impacts of the city and all that. But largely speaking, I don't know of many people in New York who would look at this project as a failure. They would call it a successful experience and something that improved the city rather than diminish the city. But John, having been in the trenches on all of that and looking back, when you walk the High Line today, what do you think after being in those weeds for so long?
Yeah, it's funny. When that first version opened, you know, I, when I started working on this case, literally people were mailing me pieces of concrete and
Wow.
sending it to our board of directors and claiming this thing was the biggest blight on the city. It was this public safety nuisance. It was this horrible thing that was, blemishing, beautiful New York City, and something had to be done about it. And I remember the first time I went up there on my own, and I was meeting somebody, one of the access points under the bridge, and I'm sitting there and I hear people walking by and they said, "Yeah, I'll meet you on the High Line. I'll meet you on the High Line." I said, "People are meeting on the High." I had to almost pinch myself to see what this had transformed into at that point. And it's interesting. I've spoken to some folks, afterwards, just kind of looking back, particularly to the local neighborhood people, like you said, who initially supported the preservation of the High Line to prevent gentrification, which of course, gentrification on steroids is what you have over there right now. And I said to them, I said, "What do you think?" And I'll never forget the quote. They said, "We were bought off by beauty." And that's what they said to me, that, the thing is just so beautiful and such a unique amenity that it's hard to really find a lot of fault with it. I would say, there's probably two structural issues with it, which I don't know how they solve longer term. Probably the one mistake that was made at this time was that they did not lock in a regular source of maintenance to, basically take care of the line over time. The Friends of the High Line have turned themselves essentially into a small corporation. They employ somewhere between 80 and 100 people a year. The problem is they have to raise $16 to $20 million a year every year in order to maintain the line, keep it clean, keep it secure, keep up the plants, do tours, everything that they do up there. And, normally when you have something like this, you would have built in a TIF or something along those lines, or you've got the people who are benefiting from this, who are the businesses, the buildings in the areas, would be cooking in some small amount of tax every year to pay for this thing. They didn't do it. And they went back and tried to get a TIF passed after the fact, and they couldn't get it through. So this is a structural problem they have long term, that they have to keep raising so much money every year. Now, New York's sort of sui generis, and they seem to be able to find, fancy donors, but they're kind of running out of places to put names on at this stage. So that's something to keep an eye on, because basically the city does not contribute anything money-wise to the High Line. It's almost entirely maintained through private funding by the Friends of the High Line, who have a long-term operating agreement with the city. That's how the thing was structured. So they're responsible for maintenance, safety, security, upkeep, all of that stuff. The other issue is that it's almost a victim of its own success.
Mm-hmm.
And any of you have watched this or have been up there, if you go up there on the weekend, you can't really walk the High Line. There's so many people who go see this thing. I think it's the second or third most visited site by tourists in the entire city at this point, which is astounding if you think about the other places people can go. And so they have to start metering how many people are allowed on or not. And even when they meter it, it's really hard to enjoy it unless you get there at an off hour, a time, or when the weather's not bad. So that's another issue, as I said, how they're going to kind of address that over time as well. This is more a victim, as I say, of their own success at this point. These are nice problems to have, to try to figure out what to do with it at this point. But it's really been an extraordinary thing looking back. If I think about where this started, now 35 years ago for me, that's how long I've been involved with this thing, to where it has come today. It's really mind-boggling still. Even today, it's mind-boggling. It's probably, the number one thing in my career I'm, most proud to have worked on. It was just, a really tremendous project, both how it worked out. And, I could give you the two postscripts on this,
Sure, please do.
which are not well known. So, don't feel bad for CSX. CSX was able to persuade the IRS to allow them to take a $100 million tax write-off for a charitable deduction for this. It did actually get litigated at, kind of a lower examiner stage. I actually had to testify, and you had a battle of appraisals and all the other stuff, but they were able to get $100 million. And this was before the tax code was amended back in the previous administration. So they were able to save about $35 million in taxes in 1 year, which was pretty nice for them. And then, of course, let's go back to our friends from the Chelsea property owners and the, you want to talk about robber barons, these real estate developers. Mr. Gottesman, at one of the annual dinners that the Friends of the High Line give in order to raise this money I mentioned that they have to do, he had gotten a table, and I saw him, and Jerry was probably in his 80s, and he and I had really battled it out over the years. And he saw me, and he stuck out his little bony finger, and he went like this, and he said, "John, I just sold my property. Guess how much I got." I won't keep you waiting, but he essentially, because he knew what was going on, talk about insider information, he was able to aggregate all of these transfer development rights, because he was right under the High Line, and he's got two 30-story apartment buildings on either side of the High Line if you go there. So he just sold the property with the entitlements built in for the upzoning, and he got, I was told by him, and it was confirmed by somebody else, $875 million.
Unbelievable.
So, the little things, that come out of this are really pretty astounding.
Yes, I think we have dispelled the myth here that preservation is just a suck on the local economy. And there's so many other examples of that. Grand Central Terminal, of course, being the foremost example in the United States, where some of the highest rents you'll find in America or anywhere are at Grand Central Terminal, this lovely restored place. And the High Line, of course, speaks for itself. And once again, it's Adrian Untermyer here with Jonathan Broder on the Wrecking Ball podcast series from the Historical Society of New York Courts. We're going to take a brief break, let you digest some of that information. And when we come back, we are going to return to our favorite segment entitled Your Daily Ada Louise. So stick with us for a minute, and we will be right back.
Wrecking Ball is brought to you by the Historical Society of the New York Courts, which is dedicated to preserving just that, New York's vast legal history. For more information about that important group, just Google Historical Society of the New York Courts or visit history.nycourts.gov.
Hello again, everybody. My name is Adrian Untermyer, your host here on the Wrecking Ball podcast series from the Historical Society of New York Courts, where we tackle those interesting, thorny, interrelated questions of historic preservation, the law, and the great city and state of New York. Once again, here with Jonathan Broder, former General Counsel of the Consolidated Rail Corporation, also known as Conrail, also known as Big Blue, also known as the railroad with the old can opener logo on the side of it. And we will let your Googling figure that out on your end, dear listener. But we've returned here with John for our favorite segment entitled Your Daily Ada Louise, where we dig deep into the archives of the former architectural critic and lady about town, Ada Louise Huxtable, who of course was the famed architectural critic for the New York Times, a great influencer in the field of historic preservation, and a veritable goldmine of quotes about preservation of the law in the city. And John, which Ada Louise quote have you picked to bring with us today? Are you willing to tell us a little bit why you picked it and what the quote is?
Sure. So it's a quote about Penn Station.
Okay.
And her quote is basically that not that Penn Station is the Parthenon, but it might as well be because we can never again afford a 9-acre structure of superbly detailed travertine any more than we could build one of solid gold. It is a monument to the lost art of magnificent construction, other values aside. And the reason I picked that as relevant to today is it takes me back to a meeting I had during the days everybody was trying to tear the High Line down. And I got a meeting with a very powerful man at the time, a guy by the name of Peter Powers, who was the chief of staff for Rudy Giuliani. And this is where we were pleading with them to, not continue to pursue the demolition of the project at this point, back in the early 90s. I explained to him what the High Line was. He didn't really know, and why it was this essentially unique structure. And what I argued to him was at the point is, once something like this is gone, it can never be recreated again. I don't know what the best and highest use was. I mean, we had talked potentially of a park, but we also talked about at one point, before they extended the 7 train, that perhaps you could extend it and connect it to the L.
Right.
That at one point, Virgin Atlantic wanted to run like a little trolley up along there. Another guy had the idea of creating a movable parking lot.
Oh.
Where you could park your car at 34th Street, and if you finished down at 12th or 14th Street, they'd move your car down along the line, and you could get your car down there. There were a lot of really creative ideas, but we had taken a look at it at that point, and to essentially recreate the High Line in $1992, just to assemble the real estate, which is not really even feasible anymore, would have been just $1 billion. Put aside what it would have cost to construct this unique structure at that stage of the game. And this structure, if you walk it, at times is as wide as 4 tracks wide. I mean, it's a substantial piece of infrastructure. It's not some skinny line that you see sort of running down there. And of course, it had this, really beautiful New York Central engineering design to it as well. And so when I saw this quote, it really made me think back at that moment. And I said, in the end, it's really a city asset in my mind. It's no longer a rail asset. It really can't really be repurposed at this point more, at least for rail freight at this stage of the game. I said, in my mind, the city would be making just a historic error to let this thing go. And fortunately, they didn't, unlike Penn Station. And we're lucky enough to be here to enjoy the beauty of this really unique piece of transportation infrastructure.
Excellent. Well, John, thank you for this thoroughly informative, thoroughly enjoyable trip through railroad history, preservation history, New York City history, American history, you name it. We touched on it today. John, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, Adrian.
All right. We will see you on the next episode of Wrecking Ball. Remember to like, follow, subscribe, all that good stuff. And wishing you a wonderful day wherever the day is occurring. Talk to you next time. Bye.